Good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming to my lecture on Thomas Willis. As you will know, Thomas Willis was born 400 years ago. On 27th of January 2021, we will celebrate the 400th anniversary of his birth. And we consider Thomas Willis as one of the greatest neuroanatomists of all time. And I think it is fitting that we celebrate the opening of NeurotechEU with the life of Thomas Willis. Thomas Willis's name is usually associated with the arteriosus circle, named after him, and he also coined the term neurologia or neurology, and also he formed the foundation of neuroanatomy, comparative neuroanatomy, neuropathology, and also clinical neurology. So I think it is fitting to celebrate the opening of Neurotech with Willis. As you will see, Willis's life was shaped by the Civil War, and also his medical education was disrupted. And in fact, it's ironical that his education and training benefited from this disruption, because he didn't have to go through 14 years of a painful memorizing of Aristotle and Galen. So we have a message here that it's better not to have an education than if this education is not preparing you for critical thinking, and just studying outdated, memorizing outdated facts is probably not useful. So I will want to convince you the next 25-30 minutes that Willis's life is still relevant for us today. He will show us how you can combine clinical work with experimental work, publishing, teaching, and then you can have a lasting legacy. So I think Willis showed us that by combining his insightful critical observations with his original pathological studies, his inquiring mind established links that are still astonishing 400 years on. So I think for these reasons, Willis's name and achievements should be proclaimed to every new generation of students, especially if they have links with neuroscience. So I'm going to share my screen and go through Willis's life with you. And you will see that Oxford is a great place to study the history of neuroscience, and especially the life of Oxford. Of Willis. So Willis was born not far from Oxford in Great Bedwin in Wiltshire, and his house is still there in this small village. It's called the Ivy Cottage, and it's in the northeast part of Farm Lane in Great Bedwin. And he's around 8 years old when they moved from here closer to Oxford, because Rachel, Willis's mom, inherited some land and this cottage, the Ferry Cottage in North Hingsea, where they lived, and they moved here. Unfortunately, Willis's mom died 2 years later and was buried in North Hingsea Church. And Willis is 10 years old at that time. Now, the father remarried, and Willis started studying at Oxford. So at this time, Oxford is rather small, but nevertheless, some of the colleges are already established, and you can see the outline of Broad Street, Woodstock Road, and also some of the gates of Oxford. So this map is from 1644. And this is the time when many of the colleges were established. So my own college, St. John's, was established in 1555 by a rich merchant tailor, Thomas White. And so these colleges are growing now. And by 1660, Oxford University admitted around 400 students. So it was becoming a place of scholarship. However, the scholarship was disrupted by the Civil War, and then subsequently the Protectorate, Commonwealth, and then the Restoration in Oxford. So these scholars were stranded here in Oxford, and some of them they couldn't study, so they were interacting. So Willis indeed started studying at Oxford, and got his BA and MA. So he started at 1636, matriculated at Christ Church. We have the documents to prove that. And then he after getting his MA and BA, the Civil War broke out, and then his studies were disrupted. Originally, he was planning to study theology, religious studies, but then he switched to medicine. Medicine was 14 years in those days to study medicine, and basically the Civil War disrupted his studies. So Oxford became a garrison town. The forces of Cromwell were attacking Oxford. The king, queen, they resided at Christ Church and Merton colleges. The French ambassador was at St. John's. So really, Oxford was basically a garrison town, and plague, very infectious plague, was sweeping across at that time. So that was not the time of studying. In fact, at St. John's College, we have a cannonball which was fired into the college by Cromwell, by the rebel forces, because St. John's was a royalist. So Willis is royalist. He was enlisted in the Dover's regiment for the services of Charles I. And after the siege of Oxford, Charles in 1646 is signing his degree to be able to practice medicine. So basically he was rewarded for his loyalty with the medical degree, and he escaped the study of Galen and Aristotle. So this is his degree signed by Charles I. And after this, Oxford was occupied. Charles was executed in 1649. Then Oliver Cromwell took over for 10 years. Then after the death of Oliver Cromwell, in the Restoration, Charles II was appointed. And again, Willis was rewarded for his loyalty and was elected Sedleyan Professor of Natural Philosophy in Oxford. So during the Civil War, the heads of houses changed, and also the professors changed according to their loyalties to the king or to Cromwell. So after the Restoration, Willis's career took off, and he started writing his books. And here in pink, you can see all the books he produced. And at the last 9 years of his life, he moved to London in 1667, just after the Great Fire of London. And he was extremely productive. He published all these books. The second volume of the Pharmaceutical Rationalis was published posthumously. He was planning books on genital disease and also tumors, but unfortunately on the 11th of November in 1675, he died unexpectedly in pneumonia, and he could never produce these books. And some of his book, like these methods of preserving those that are well from the plague, this was published also posthumously after his death. So Willis's life is very interesting for us, because here we have somebody who got his medical certificate and started practicing as a young doctor. And initially, he cannot practice in Oxford because he didn't have the experience, and he had to go to the surrounding cities and villages. And he has his casebook, which was preserved, and it's in the possession of Wellcome Trust, and it was published by Kenneth Dewhurst. And we have 50 cases, which young Willis, as a practicing clinician, is making notes of. So if we look at the locations where his patients are, you can see that they are in the 50 to 60 mile radius from Oxford in neighboring villages. And also when we look at the cases, so for instance, Abingdon is one of these places where he was riding out and then competing with other young doctors, and not only qualified doctors, but also charlatans and Quakers. And he had to fight for his patients. And we have these 50 cases, different locations, and also different diseases, so respiratory system, digestive, urinary, and so on. And from these notes, we know that he produced the most incredible description of some of these diseases, like malaria, typhoid fever, puerperal fever, neurosyphilis, narcolepsy, restless leg syndrome, was described by Willis. We also know that he produced a device from a whale bone, which the patient used to help in the achalasia of the cardia, so push down the food into the stomach. He's describing myasthenia gravis, so that some of the patients has difficulties after repeated movement to move again. So in the morning they are fine, but not in the evening. He is describing a very interesting case when there is a conductional hearing loss is improving when there is extra noise. So the husband is employing a drummer to drum by talking to the wife who had hearing problems. And this is still code today, paracusis willisi. He is described the different forms of diabetes, the mellitus and insipidus. He noticed that the different urine samples were preferred by flies differentially. And so basically, he was a fantastic clinician who was observing his patients. In addition to this, while practicing, he also did some dissections. And William Petty was the Tomlin's reader of anatomy, a position which is still associated to Christ Church College. And the Tomlin's reader could claim the body of a certain number of executed prisoners in a certain radius in Oxford. And they dissected with Willis in Petty's residence off High Street, the Berkeley Hole. And they made some really amazing observations. And initially, Willis was struggling with his medical practice. He had to share horse with his colleagues to get to these neighboring villages. But then on 14th of December, 1650, there was a very interesting case when an executed prisoner, Anne Green, was delivered to Petty's residence. And Anne Green was tried and convicted for killing her own child, newborn child. It was a miscarriage of the 17th week, but nevertheless, they tried her. She was 22 years old. She was a servant, and Geoffrey Reed, Sir Thomas's grandson, who was 16 or 17, seduced her, and basically they tried her and found guilty for the death of this illegitimate child. Now, she was hanged at Castle Hill and in Oxford, and then the relatives even helped her to die by hanging on her feet, as you can see here on this leaflet. And also some of the soldiers were pushing her chest with their guns. Then she was cut off, put to the coffin, and delivered in the morning to Willis and Petty's residence. Then they noticed that she still had some faint pulse, and then she also slightly vocalized. And then the soldiers started stamping on her chest to help her to die again, but probably it was the best resuscitation method, the chest compression. And then Willis and Petty took over. They asked help from Bartust and Clarke, who were also medics in this circle. They let some blood out. They gave some hot cordial to Anne Green, and they also pushed some feather down her throat. Then Anne Green was put into bed with another lady to warm her up. And this is when Anne Green is saying, "Behold God's providence." So after this, Anne Green was pardoned mostly by the soldiers. And they didn't attempt to hang her again. And she fully recovered. And she even took the coffin home to show it to her friends. And subsequently, she had children as well. So after this, this leaflet was produced and then distributed, and Willis's and Petty's career took off, and then they became very famous, and they could charge the rich and treat the poor free. And this resurrection of Anne Green happened off High Street in Berkeley Hole. And at the site of this building now, there is another very old building, and it's now hosting a Thai restaurant, the Chiang Mai Kitchen, which I very warmly recommend to everybody if you visit Oxford. So this is the time when Willis had an amazing circle of friends. Christopher Wren, who produced all the illustrations, Richard Lower, who was dissecting, Thomas Millington, Edmund King, Robert Boyle, the chemist, and also William Petty. So on the title page of the second edition of the Cerebri Anatomy, you can see these characters, and they didn't have an anatomy theater at the time, so they were dissecting in their own residence. They had access to fresh tissue, and there is some evidence that they used from the prescriptions of Robert Boyle. We know that they used a port, which has a very high alcohol content, and they mix it with vinegar to pickle these brains. And if you look at these brains, you can see that the penetration was not complete, so the colors varied. And if you look at the illustrations, Rand's illustrations in Cerebri Anatomy or Anima Brutorum, you can see that the outside of the brain was shaded a bit more, suggesting that perhaps they used this kind of fixative on these brains. Willis, his career took off, and he moved to Merton Street to Beam Hall. If we walk down to Merton Street, probably the street did not change too much over the centuries. So I showed this video for you. You can see the Postmaster Hall, then Beam Hall, and this is the house where Thomas Willis worked. This is the house where the word neurology was first given. On the opposite side, you can see the Chapel of Merton College. This is one of the oldest colleges established in the 13th century. And this, you can see the Porter's Lodge just opposite Beam Hall, where Thomas Willis and his team worked. Now, there is a little bit of debate whether he actually lived in this pink white building or the Beam Hall. Some suggest that he lived and only worked in the other. They were both connected. So Beam Hall, the name itself, is kind of a nickname. The official name of this building should be really Beeham Hall, because Gilbert de Beeham, the 9th Vice Chancellor of University of Oxford, owned this first, and then subsequently the name changed to Beam Hall. And I just want to show you this other building to you quickly. There's the Postmaster's Lodge to the left, and this is where William Harvey lived for a few years, and also Anthony Wood, whom I will mention in a moment. So this is where his neighbors were also very famous. Now, so the origin of, I mentioned that the Beam Hall is a kind of a nickname. If we go inside the building, and I borrowed this video from Stuart Panther, who have many other videos of Oxford buildings, you can see that there are some elaborate beams in this building. And that's why it's called also Beam Hall, because probably because of these beams. Initially it was Beeham Hall, and then it changed to Aula Bohemia or Aula Trabina. Trabina means made of wood in Latin. And then because of this, probably they found it funny to call it Beam Hall, and this name was sticking with the building. Now, in 1553, Corpus Christi College purchased the building, and then they rebuilt it, they renewed it, and Willis worked and lived here from 1657 to 1667, 57 to 67. And so it is still debated whether he actually just worked in Beam Hall and lived in the neighboring number 3 Merton Street. Nevertheless, the two buildings are connected and they are adjacent to each other. And the neighboring building, which is Postmaster Hall, this is where William Harvey lived a few years before, and also Anthony Wood, who recorded in his memoirs also what was going on during these turbulent times in Oxford. So it was actually very useful that he made all these notes. The first book Thomas Willis produced was on fevers. And basically, if you consider fevers as an allegory, it was basically also describing the biochemistry of the whole body. In this book, he's also describing the different fevers, the continuous, intermittent, and putrid fevers, and describes specifically the fevers associated with malaria. And his second book is the Cerebri Anatomy, which has been in print for 200 years. It basically the first time when neurologia, the word neurology was used in Samuel Partridge's translation, but neurologia was used here in Latin, and in the Oxford English Dictionary gives neurology to Willis. This is the Cerebri Anatomy is where Willis describes the arteriosus circle at the base of the brain, which is formed from the two internal carotid and the two vertebral arteries. And then you have the three pairs of anterior, middle, and posterior cerebral arteries supplying the convexity. So Willis emphasized the physiological relevance of this, and also one of his patients who died in stomach cancer, he noticed that there was an occlusion in one of the carotid arteries, and in spite of that, the patient showed no signs of any symptoms associated with that, which Willis knew, and he suggested that it was because of the compensatory mechanisms of this arteriosus circle. So he gives credit to Richard Lauer and also Wren. Basically, Lauer was given credit for his skillful, so this is what Willis is writing, he a skillful anatomist whose knife and wit I willingly acknowledge. So Lauer did some of the dissections for this publication, and also Wren did the illustrations. So Wren delineates with his most skillful hand many of the figures of the brain and skull, whereby work might be more exact. And this is exactly because of Willis's of Wren's illustrations in Willis's publications, why actually the circle is associated to Willis. So Wren was also an architect, and a fantastic one. So All Souls College, this was designed by Wren, and also the Sheldonian Theatre, where all the students matriculate and also they get their degrees. So Wren drawings were masterpieces, and this is why this arteriosus circle is now associated with Willis. There are many others who describe this circle, and but Willis had the best illustrations from Wren. He also described it in other species, like here you can see at the base of the brain of a sheep, and he also noticed that the sheep has smaller and less convoluted cerebral cortex, and suggested that the human cerebral cortex is the seat of the higher cognitive functions because of the volume and the convolutions. Now, if you look at the dissected circle of Willis, and this preparation was done by Professor Eckhard Kasper a long time ago, you can see the two internal carotid arteries, and you can also see the two vertebral arteries which unite into the basilar artery, and then they continue into the posterior cerebral mostly. And then here you can see the anterior and the mid-cerebral arteries. So Willis recognized the physiological importance of this circle, and there were many others who described the circle of Willis before him, Falloppio, and especially we should give credit to Jacob Wepfer, who in Switzerland described the circle of before. Perfectly good descriptions, but Thomas Willis had the best illustration, and perhaps he emphasized the clinical pathological relevance in the clearest fashion. Now, William Harvey was in the neighboring house a few years before, in the Postmaster's Hall at Merton Street, before Willis, And obviously, he must have had an influence on the medics around him. But they didn't overlap at the street itself. So although they were living in neighboring house, if you look at the years when Willis lived here from 45 to so when William Harvey lived here for a year, when he was warden of Merton College, Willis didn't move in yet. So they just missed each other with a decade. So in the cerebral anatomy, Willis also describes cranial nerves, and he completely reformed the numbering of the cranial nerves after Galenus, and described 10 pairs. And he discovered the spinal accessory nerve, and his illustrations are superb even today. And very accurate if we compare it with the real preparations. In the cerebral anatomy, this is one of my favorite figures on the left, and this is basically the summary of the autonomous nervous system. So you have the sympathetic, parasympathetic nerves here, and you can see the sympathetic paravertebral chain. You can also see the vagus nerve. You can even see the plexus cordis, which is innervating the heart. And you can even see the recurrent laryngeal nerve from the vagus innervating the larynx. So this is so accurate that, in fact, if you have a look at a contemporary figure, you have quite a lot of similarities. So you could use this drawing for teaching today. They also tested the function of the vagus nerve. So they ligated the vagus nerve and they looked at the effect on the heart. So they were way ahead of their times. And that particular diagram was probably drawn by Richard Lauer, not by Rand. Now, the next book was on Pathology cerebri and nervosi, and this is where they describe the pathological processes, including epilepsy. So Willis is 45 years old at the peak of his career, and he keeps publishing. In his next book, he argues that the cause of hysteria was located in the brain and not in other body parts. And his views on the circulation were very advanced, similar to William Harvey. But some of the ideas on muscle action, despite the suggestion of the reflex action, were less clear. But nevertheless, he distinguished voluntary and involuntary movements, and that was a huge step. One of his best works was the Anima Brutorum, and this is where he's comparing different species. And here you have a figure which is stunning. On the left, you have a normal brain, and on the right, you have a brain from a boy who had signs of intractable epilepsy and learning difficulties. And Willis noticed that this brain of the boy had more but smaller sulci and gyri. So probably he described polymicrogyria case and associated this brain developmental abnormality with these cognitive dysfunctions. So Willis is way ahead of his time. He's suggesting that the cerebrum is the primary seat of rational soul in man and the sensitive soul in animals, and it is the source of movements and ideas. So he's basing this statement on his comparative work and also his clinical observations. In the Anima Brutorum, he's describing the nervous system of lots of invertebrates, like this lobster, or this worm, or this oyster, or some other invertebrates. And the illustrations are, again, splendid. His last book is the Pharmaceutical rationalis. And basically, he's describing in the first volume all the available medicines. And he's describing different forms of polyuria, diabetes mellitus and insipidus, and he even had these observations on dogs and cats. The second volume, which was published just after Willis's death, it includes respiratory, gastrointestinal, and dermatological diseases, and describes contemporary medical treatments, which included bleeding, purgation, blistering, branding, and vomiting as therapies. So if you look at the illustrations in this book, they are incredible. So the muscle layers of the stomach, or look at the structure of the lungs, or even the microstructure and almost like histological preparations of the various tissues. And the last book, which was published after his death, probably he didn't even intend to publish this, is basically a plain and easy method of presenting those that are well from the plague. And this was probably edited by John Hemmings, his pharmacist. And this is the only book which is published in English, all the others were published in Latin. So what other documents do we have to learn more about Willis's life? And I'm sitting here with Professor Trevor Hughes, who is the greatest expert on the life of Willis, together with Alastair Compston. They both wrote incredible books on Willis. Alastair's book is coming out this September. And basically, there are some original letters in the St. John's Library, and these letters were written by Dr. Higgs to Coventry, and then they ended up in St. John's Library. And it's really humbling to look at Willis's ideas in these letters, how he's advising other doctors for treatments. And there are also letters from Richard Lower, who was 10 years younger than Willis and was the student, but he's also corresponded with the same individuals. And Richard Lower was very loyal to Willis. After Willis's death, they attacked some of Willis's ideas on fever, and he defended it. And also Richard Lower had a great contribution to the circulatory system, and he was the first who performed blood transfusion. So in those days, they had this idea that if you have a really vigorous, strong animal like a bull, and you take the blood and you administer it to a patient, then they will also be much more vigorous. And so they did transfusions. They also used sometimes the relatives, and it's very interesting how courageous they were to use these transfusions, and what was the rationale behind that. There are some also letters from John Radcliffe in this pack. They also corresponded. He was also a very famous medic, and also he contributed a lot. He donated a lot of money to the university. Lots of buildings are called after John Radcliffe: the John Radcliffe Hospital, Radcliffe Infirmary, Radcliffe Camera. So these medics were sticking together, and they were corresponding. Some of the books which we have at St. John's College Library, they came from the Brown Willis family, from the grandson of Thomas Willis. And it's interesting to contemplate that maybe some of these notes are actually from Willis's family or from Willis himself in these books. So I hope I gave you a flavor of this very interesting time in Oxford. And if you want to know more about this intellectual fermentation and how these scholars in different disciplines, they were interacting during these very turbulent times, then I really recommend this book by Ian Pearce, The Instance of the Finger Post. This is my favorite book ever. And this is really introducing this time. And there are some fictitious characters, although Sarah Blundy is partially Anne Green, but you also have lots of real characters, and Ian knows history extremely well. And you're really beginning to understand how these scholars were interacting and thinking, and how Oxford became really the center of scholarship during these times. In fact, Ian's theory is that these scholars were stranded in Oxford and they were kind of unemployed. And this is why they just followed their curiosity, and they had this lasting legacy. So I hope I managed to give you a flavor of Thomas Willis's life. And I think there are several messages for us to neurotech from the life of Willis. The first of all, it's better not to have a bad university education than it's better not to have an education than a bad university education. You can see it from the life of Willis. So he escaped from this memorizing. Also, it's very important that we combine our clinical work with experimental work and also with teaching and publishing. It's very important that when we publish, we illustrate our work very well, because then it will have a bigger impact. And also you can see these interactions between different disciplines. So sometimes very special circumstances can trigger intellectual fermentation. And if you look at what's going on in the world now, perhaps it's triggering the revolution in online teaching methods, international interactions between universities, and perhaps when we will look back to this period, it was actually contributed to the revolution of the education. So we will have more interdisciplinary and more international interactions after that. So hopefully neurotech will revolutionize university teaching, and when we will look back in 40 or 400 years time, then we will be very proud that we participated today. I thank you very much for your attention.